When Jesus took his final breath, the entire planet reacted. The time was 3 in the afternoon. Jerusalem was crowded with those who had come for Passover. The sun ought to be shining brightly above, yet instead, blackness, total, otherworldly blackness, shrouds the region like a burial cloth. Parents grab their young ones. Men fall quiet. People look upward in fear. This can't be an eclipse. Such a thing is impossible when the moon is full. This represents something completely different. Yet this is merely the start. Almost immediately, the ground starts shaking violently. Burial chambers split apart. The enormous temple stones begin quaking. And within the most holy place, something rips apart. Something humans were never supposed to touch. The curtain, standing 60 feet tall and 4 inches in thickness, tears from its highest point to its lowest, with a noise that reverberates through all time. The events following Jesus' final moments weren't simply the conclusion of one person's existence. This was when the heavenly and earthly dimensions crashed together, when the invisible world burst into our tangible realm with such intensity that even Rome's battle-hardened guards dropped to their knees in fear and wonder. The truth is, many of us are familiar with the account of Jesus' execution. We've learned about the crucifixion, the spikes, the agony. Yet what transpired during those holy moments, right after he breathed his last? 7 miraculous occurrences that rattled the very core of existence. Phenomena so significant that their effects continue echoing through time, even now. How would you have reacted had you watched the heavens turn dark at midday? Had you experienced the earth fracturing under your feet? Had you observed the deceased moving through Jerusalem's pathways? These weren't random happenings. They weren't ordinary natural occurrences. They represented God's answer to humanity's ultimate sacrifice, his supernatural mark inscribed throughout all creation. In this presentation, we'll examine these 7 remarkable occurrences that happened when Jesus released his Spirit and explore their continuing significance for our lives. We'll observe how ancient biblical predictions manifested in ways that rendered even those carrying out the execution without words. We'll comprehend why the planet couldn't stay quiet when its maker perished. However, I must caution you, one of these manifestations was so astounding, so beyond rational explanation, that it transformed everything regarding our comprehension of mortality. It caused the religious authorities to fear. It caused warriors to bow down. And it ought to cause us to reflect that if creation itself testified to this event, what implications does that carry for how we live? Therefore, let's return 2 millennia and observe what occurred when God's Son took his final breath. It started at midday. The sun stood at its zenith, burning down upon Jerusalem during the most sacred period of the year. Passover visitors occupied every avenue, every plaza. The city vibrated with activity and festivity. Then, as though someone had pulled a drape over the sky, blackness descended. Not the slow fading of an incoming tempest, not the gentle arrival of twilight. This was immediate, beyond nature, total blackness that consumed the brightness entirely. Matthew's 27th chapter, 45th verse, records that from the 6th hour through the 9th hour, from midday through 3 o'clock, blackness blanketed the entire region. Yet this wasn't ordinary blackness. This was the blackness of heavenly condemnation, the shade of God's fury descending upon transgression. Parents halted their discussions, their speech freezing on their lips. Young ones moved nearer to their fathers. Even the creatures appeared to detect something was profoundly amiss. The atmosphere became heavy with an unnatural pressure, as though creation was pausing. You must grasp, this defied possibility. During Passover, The moon reaches fullness, making a solar eclipse impossible. The educated religious scholars understood this. The Romans understood this. Everyone gazing at that darkened heaven understood they were observing something outside natural law, outside rationality. Yet God had announced this event hundreds of years earlier. Through Amos the prophet in his 8th chapter, 9th verse, he had proclaimed, "And on that day I shall make the sun set at midday, and I shall bring darkness upon the earth during daylight." This wasn't arbitrary celestial chance. This was prophetic realization. The sun, which God had ordered to illuminate the world, now concealed its presence because it couldn't endure witnessing the scene below. The world's light was expiring, and even the natural sun grieved. Consider what this signified throughout those 3 hours. In that supernatural blackness, Jesus remained suspended between the celestial and terrestrial realms, carrying the burden of every transgression ever made. The blackness wasn't merely surrounding him. It was the tangible expression of God's condemnation falling upon his Son rather than upon humanity. The Father averted his gaze. The Son did likewise. All creation took part in this universal moment where divine righteousness and compassion met. If the Son concealed its presence, when Jesus assumed our transgressions upon himself, what does that reveal about the burden he bore? What does it reveal about the price of our salvation? Throughout 3 hours, blackness dominated, yet blackness was never intended to speak last. And while the heavens mourned overhead, something even more forceful was starting to shake under their feet. The ground started shifting. Initially, it was barely noticeable, a slight tremor that caused the Roman guards to adjust their footing, a vibration that made the women observing from afar glance downward with bewilderment. Yet then, it intensified. The earth began heaving, as though it could no longer support the magnitude of what was occurring above. Matthew's 27th chapter, 51st verse records that when Jesus called out and surrendered his spirit, the earth trembled. Yet this wasn't merely geological movement. This was the planet responding to its creator's passing. Visualize the setting. The blackness that had fallen at midday still enveloped Golgotha like death wrappings. In that strange twilight, the ground under the execution site started cracking. Splits emerged in the stone hillside. Jerusalem's foundations shuddered. Structures wavered. People lost balance, grasping for surfaces, for something stable to grip. Yet nothing remained stable anymore. The ground that had appeared so enduring, so dependable, was fracturing under their feet. The tremor wasn't limited to Calvary. It spread through the city, through the temple areas, through the avenues where visitors had assembled for Passover. Burial sites broke open. Ancient rocks that had existed for ages suddenly moved and fractured. The earth was physically splitting apart. This recalled for believers another mountain that had shaken. At Sinai's mountain, when God came down to deliver the law to Moses, Exodus's 19th chapter, 18th verse, records that the entire mountain shook tremendously. The earth had trembled then when God descended in might. Now it trembled once more, not because God was coming down, but because God was departing. The contrast is overwhelming. The one who had spoken the mountains into being, who had shaped the earth with his own hands, was now making it shake simply by departing from it. Creation acknowledged its creator, even in passing, and it couldn't stay steady without him. Yet something more profound was occurring in this tremor. The shaking earth signified that the previous system was being rattled to its core. The former covenant, established on regulations and offerings, was breaking apart. The religious structure that had kept humanity separated from God was dissolving. This wasn't merely the earth shifting. It was heaven announcing that the former age had ended and something fresh had arrived. The ground shook because the spiritual foundation was transforming. Everything that appeared enduring and unchangeable was being exposed as fleeting, replaceable, concluded. And amid this turmoil, something extraordinary occurred. The tremor didn't merely destroy things, it unsealed things. Burial sites that had been closed for generations suddenly stood open. Death was being contested, even while Jesus remained dying on the execution site. The earth trembled because it understood what we're continuing to discover, that this event wasn't a conclusion. It was a commencement. The former world was breaking apart to create space for something completely fresh. Yet while the earth was fracturing beneath them, something sacred within the temple was breaking open overhead. Within the temple, something impossible was taking place. The curtain, that enormous holy drape that divided the most holy place from the remaining temple, was ripping, not fraying along its edges, not gradually deteriorating after years of use. This 4-inch thick tapestry, woven with strands of blue, purple, and crimson, was splitting from its highest to its lowest point in one fierce, supernatural tear. You must comprehend what this curtain symbolized. It wasn't merely fabric suspended in a structure. It was the physical representation of humanity's division from God. Throughout 1,500 years, this obstacle had existed between sinful humanity and holy God. Only the chief priest could pass beyond it, and only annually, and only with blood. The curtain stood 60 feet in height and 30 feet in width. Historical accounts tell us it was so dense that horse teams couldn't tear it. The temple attendants who cared for it required ladders simply to access the top. This wasn't something that could tear by accident. This wasn't something that could be damaged by human force. Yet Matthew's 27th chapter, 51st verse records that at the instant Jesus died, this impervious obstacle split from its highest to its lowest point, not lowest to highest, as though human hands had seized and pulled, from highest to lowest, torn by God's own hand. Visualize the setting within the temple. The priests are performing their responsibilities, possibly preparing for the evening offering. The incense is burning. The ceremonies are continuing as they have for ages. Then, without warning, the noise of tearing fills the sacred area. The curtain that has hung there for generations suddenly tears apart with a noise like thunder. The priests would have recoiled in terror. The most holy place, the most sacred location on earth, the place where God's presence resided, was now revealed. The obstacle was removed. The division was finished. The path was cleared. Yet what did this signify? The Hebrews writer in chapter 10, verses 19 through 20, provides the explanation. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we possess boldness to access the most holy place through Jesus' blood, through a fresh and living path opened for us beyond the curtain, meaning his body. The curtain wasn't merely torn fabric. It was Jesus' body shattered for humanity. The obstacle between God and humanity wasn't merely fabric, it was transgression. And when Jesus died, accepting our transgression upon himself, the division concluded permanently. You no longer require priests, ceremonies, or structures to approach God. You don't require waiting for designated times or particular observances. You don't require bringing offerings or earning entrance into his presence. The entrance is open. The obstacle is removed. The path is accessible. The curtain didn't tear to release God from the most holy place. It tore to allow humanity in. Consider what this signifies for your existence now. When you communicate with God, you're not addressing a remote God who may or may not hear. You're accessing the universe's throne room through Jesus' sacrifice's torn curtain. When you wrestle with guilt or disgrace, you're not confined outside God's presence. The path is open. The welcome is offered. The obstacle is eliminated. The torn curtain proclaims that approaching God is no longer about your achievements, your ancestry, or your religious qualifications. It's about Jesus' completed work. It's about his blood, his sacrifice, his torn body creating the path for you to return home. Yet the curtain wasn't the only thing that couldn't stay sealed that day. The burial sites themselves were about to release their hold on the deceased. Then arrived the most shocking miracle of all. Matthew's 27th chapter, verses 52 through 53, provides one of the most remarkable records in all Scripture. The burial chambers broke open. The bodies of numerous holy individuals who had died were revived. They emerged from the burial chambers following Jesus' resurrection and entered the holy city and were seen by numerous people. Allow that to penetrate for a moment. The deceased were rising, not merely one individual, not merely a vision or a dream. Numerous holy individuals, saints who had died in belief, followers who had passed away waiting for God's promise, were suddenly, miraculously, undeniably living again. The tremor had cracked open their burial chambers, yet this wasn't merely structural destruction. This was death losing its power. The burial sites that had contained these faithful servants of God for years, possibly decades, could no longer hold them. The strength of Jesus' sacrifice was so immense that it extended backward through history, forward through eternity, and downward into death's very depths. Yet observe the sequence. The burial chambers opened when Jesus died, yet the saints didn't enter the city until following his resurrection. Even in this miraculous event, Jesus remained the firstborn from death. He was the pioneer, the one who forged the path through death and into existence. These holy ones followed his path, yet they didn't go before him. Can you visualize the setting? Picture yourself moving through Jerusalem's streets 3 days following the crucifixion. The city is still filled with speculation about the blackness, the tremor, the torn curtain. And then you observe him. Your grandfather who died when you were small. Your wife who departed last winter. Your friend who was buried just beyond the city boundaries. They're moving, speaking, breathing. They're identifiably themselves, yet somehow altered, changed, glorified, completely alive. This wasn't resurrection as we typically conceive it, some far-off future occurrence. This was resurrection occurring immediately, in actual time, in history's midst. Death was being contested, overcome, undone. The prophet Ezekiel had observed this in a vision, the valley of dried bones, where God questioned, "Can these bones live?" Then he breathed existence into them, and they arose, a massive army. Now that ancient prediction was being accomplished in Jerusalem's streets. Yet who were these holy ones? We're not given their identities, yet we can speculate perhaps some of the Old Testament saints, Abraham, David, Daniel, receiving a glimpse of the resurrection existence that awaited all followers. Perhaps recent followers who had died in belief, now confirmed by Jesus' sacrifice. What did they communicate to the people they met? How did they account for their presence? We're not provided those specifics, yet we can be certain of this. Their mere existence was a declaration to Jesus' death and resurrection's power. If death released its hold even before the third day, what does that communicate about Christ's authority? What does it communicate about the hope we possess in him? Can you imagine observing a loved one, long buried, approaching you again? The astonishment, the happiness, the overwhelming awareness that death isn't the conclusion after all, that Jesus' promise of resurrection existence isn't merely future hope, it's current reality. These risen saints were living evidence that Jesus' sacrifice had universal implications. His death didn't merely satisfy transgression, it undid the curse. It didn't merely grant forgiveness, it defeated death. Even Rome's executioners, trained to handle death as routine reality, had no account for what they were observing. Yet one man among them perceived the truth and couldn't stay quiet. In the center of all this universal chaos, one man's heart was transforming. The Roman centurion had observed everything: the blackness at midday, the tremor that fractured the rocks, the manner Jesus had died, not with curses or screaming, but with words of pardon and yielding. This hardened warrior, who had supervised innumerable executions, who had observed men perish in every imaginable manner, understood he had observed something unprecedented. Matthew's 27th chapter, 54th verse records that, when the centurion and his companions who were guarding Jesus observed the tremor and everything that occurred, they were terrified and declared, "Certainly he was God's Son." Consider this man momentarily. He was a trained killer, trained to obey commands without hesitation. He had driven the spikes into Jesus' hands and feet. He had observed him suffer for 6 hours. He had been present when Jesus called to his Father. And now, following supernatural manifestations, something was breaking open within his heart. He had observed hundreds perish, thieves who cursed their destiny, rebels who displayed defiance to the conclusion, innocent men who pleaded for compassion, yet none like this, none who prayed for their executioners, none who displayed such dignity in torment, none whose death made the earth tremble. The centurion's words, "Certainly he was God's Son," weren't merely casual observation. They were acknowledgement. They were adoration. They were the declaration of a man whose complete perspective had just been demolished and reconstructed in the span of several hours. This is one of Scripture's most beautiful paradoxes. The very man who had executed the execution was now proclaiming Jesus' divinity. The hands that had driven the spikes were now shaking in worship. The voice that had commanded orders was now speaking words of belief. Grace had reached even to Golgotha, even to the executioner, even to the one who appeared most distant from God's compassion. Yet there's something more profound here. The centurion's transformation wasn't merely about what he observed. It was about what he experienced. The tremor wasn't merely external. It was internal. The blackness wasn't merely in the heavens. It was in his own soul being expelled by the illumination of recognition. He had been selected by Rome to supervise this execution. He thought he was merely performing his duty. Yet God had positioned him to be a witness, to be a trophy of grace, to be evidence that no one is outside the reach of Jesus' sacrifice. The same hands that drove the spikes now shook in worship. The same eyes that had observed Jesus suffer now perceived him for who he genuinely was. The same heart that had been hardened by years of violence was now softening under divine love's weight. This centurion represents all humanity in a way. We're all involved in Jesus' death. Our transgressions placed him on that cross. Our rebellion required his sacrifice. Yet even we, particularly we, can discover grace at the cross's base. The centurion's declaration echoes through history as a reminder that Jesus' death was not merely about satisfying transgression, but about changing hearts. Even the most hardened heart, even the most improbable person, even the executioner. And while the centurion stood in wonder, processing what he had just observed. Others were acting quickly before time expired. As evening neared, two unexpected heroes emerged from hiding. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, both Sanhedrin members, both concealed followers of Jesus, could no longer stay hidden. The same religious assembly that had condemned Jesus now had two of its members preparing to honor him in death. Joseph, described as a wealthy man and a good and righteous assembly member, went courageously to Pilate and requested Jesus' body. This wasn't merely an act of compassion, it was an act of bravery. By associating himself with Jesus, even in death, Joseph was risking everything: his standing, his position, his community status. Nicodemus, the same man who had once approached Jesus at night, inquiring about being born again, now appeared in daylight, carrying 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. This wasn't a modest burial preparation. This was royal treatment, the type reserved for monarchs. Together, these two men who had been afraid to follow Jesus publicly in existence, now handled his body with worship and attention. They touched the flesh that had carried the world's transgression. They wrapped the limbs that had been pierced for our violations. They anointed the head that had worn a thorn crown. There's something deeply moving about this setting. These men who had been quiet during Jesus' trial, who had been missing during his crucifixion, now appeared for his burial. Sometimes our greatest acts of bravery come not when everyone is observing, but when everything appears lost. They placed Jesus in Joseph's personal tomb, a fresh tomb carved from rock where no one had ever been placed. They rolled a massive stone against the opening. They sealed it according to Jewish tradition. Then they departed, thinking their final act of devotion was finished. Yet the religious authorities weren't done. Matthew's 27th chapter, verses 62 through 66, records that the following day, the chief priests and Pharisees approached Pilate with a request that reveals their alarm. "Sir, we recall that while he was still living, that deceiver stated, 'Following 3 days, I will rise again. So command the tomb to be secured until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his followers may arrive and remove the body and inform the people that he has been revived from death.'" Observe their alarm. Even in death, Jesus was viewed as a danger. Even silenced, his words about resurrection troubled them. They were so frightened of his promise that they required Roman guards and an official seal. Pilate approved their request. The tomb was secured with the finest that Roman military strength could supply. Guards were stationed. The stone was sealed with Rome's official mark. Breaking that seal would result in death. They did everything humanly achievable to guarantee that Jesus would remain deceased. They sealed the tomb not merely with stone and wax, but with the complete authority of the Roman Empire. They were attempting to prevent what they didn't comprehend, to silence what they couldn't manage. Yet here's the beautiful paradox. Every measure they took only made what was approaching more undeniable. Every guard they stationed became a witness. Every seal they positioned became proof. Every action they took to prevent resurrection only served to verify it. They sealed the tomb, attempting to prevent Jesus from rising. Yet the seal they positioned to silence Jesus would only magnify his voice. The stone they rolled to confine him would become the platform for his greatest victory. 3 days, that's all they had to wait. 3 days to contain God's Son in a borrowed tomb. 3 days to keep death satisfied with its greatest capture. Yet Sunday was approaching, and with it, the most earth-shaking revelation in human history. Sunday morning transformed everything. The women arrived at dawn carrying spices to anoint Jesus' body. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome. These faithful followers who had observed him die were now coming to honor him in death. They had one practical worry weighing on their hearts. Who will move the stone away from the tomb's opening? Yet as they neared the garden, they realized their concern was needless. Matthew's 28th chapter, verses 1 through 6 records that there had been a violent tremor, and God's angel had descended from heaven, moved back the stone, and sat upon it. His appearance was like lightning, and his garments were white as snow. The guards were so frightened of him that they shook and became like deceased men. The stone, that enormous barrier that had required multiple men to shift, that had been sealed with Roman authority, was now moved aside. Not cracked open from within, as though Jesus had forced his way out, but completely shifted aside. The tomb was open, not to allow Jesus out, but to allow the witnesses in. The angel's words to the women resound through eternity. Do not fear, for I understand that you are seeking Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, precisely as he stated. He is not here. He has risen. 4 words that altered the direction of human history. 4 words that changed sorrow into happiness, hopelessness into hope, death into existence. The women hurried to look within the tomb. John's 20th chapter records that they observed the linen cloths positioned there, and the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head, folded carefully in a location by itself. This wasn't the setting of a grave theft. This was the setting of a resurrection. The burial cloths were abandoned like a butterfly's discarded cocoon. Jesus had passed beyond them, changed, glorified, no longer requiring mortality's coverings. He had emerged from death and into eternal existence. Yet the vacant tomb was merely the start. Throughout the following 40 days, Jesus appeared to his followers repeatedly. He walked with 2 men on the Emmaus Road, revealing their understanding of Scripture. He appeared to the 11 in the upper chamber, displaying his hands and sighed to them. He prepared breakfast for them by Galilee's sea. He appeared to over 500 followers simultaneously. These weren't spirit sightings or delusions. This was Jesus, identifiable, tangible, undeniably living. He consumed food with them, conversed with them, instructed them. He demonstrated that his resurrection was not merely spiritual, but physical, not merely symbolic, but actual. The followers who had been concealing in fear were now bold witnesses. Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times, now proclaimed him publicly. Thomas, who had questioned, now worshipped. The same men who had fled in terror at the crucifixion were now prepared to perish for the resurrection's truth. The vacant tomb proclaimed God's victory over transgression and death. The risen Jesus demonstrated that his sacrifice was received, his payment was finished, his promise was genuine. Death had done its maximum and failed. The burial site had claimed its greatest prize and forfeited it. Every prophecy was accomplished, every promise was maintained, every hope was confirmed. The blackness had yielded to illumination. The tremor had settled into solid foundation. The torn curtain had created the path to eternal existence. They arrived expecting a corpse and discovered a monarch. They arrived to grieve a death and found eternal existence. They arrived to honor a memory and encountered a living Savior. The 7 supernatural occurrences that followed Jesus' death all indicated this moment. The blackness proclaimed God's condemnation on transgression. The tremor announced the previous order's shaking. The torn curtain created the path to God. The risen saints previewed resurrection existence. The centurion's belief demonstrated grace reaching the improbable. the burial prepared for the victory, and the vacant tomb demonstrated that Jesus is precisely who he claimed to be, the resurrection and the existence. Yet even following all this proof, even following all these manifestations, not everyone trusted. Some selected silence over yielding, denial over discipleship. Thousands observed these manifestations. Not all reacted identically. Some wept at the cross's base, their hearts shattered by the magnitude of what they observed. Some fled in terror from the tremor and blackness, unable to process the supernatural display. Some worshipped when they met the risen Christ, their existences permanently transformed by his presence. Others concealed it. They paid the guards to disseminate falsehoods. They selected political convenience over spiritual truth. They observed the proof and rejected it regardless. The religious authorities had required manifestations, and God provided them 7 undeniable miracles. They had requested evidence, and creation testified to Jesus' identity. Yet many of them hardened their hearts and persisted in unbelief. The question that echoes through history is identical to the one that confronts us now. If you had been present, would you have observed or dismissed? Would you have been like the centurion, whose heart was opened by what he observed? Or like the religious authorities, who rationalized away even the most evident miracles? The heavens still communicate. Every sunset recalls the day it went dark at midday. The earth still trembles. Yet now we understand it's not merely geology. It's the echo of that universal moment when the ground shook at Jesus' death. The curtain is still torn. The path is still open. And the welcome still exists. The burial site is still vacant. Not merely the tomb in Jerusalem, but every tomb that contains a follower. Death has forfeited its power. The resurrection isn't merely Jesus' victory. It's our hope, our future, our assured inheritance. Yet here's what matters supremely. This isn't merely history. This is your moment. These 7 occurrences didn't happen in isolation. They happened for you. The blackness fell so you could move in illumination. The earth shook so your foundation could be stable. The curtain tore so you could return home. The deceased rose so you could exist forever. The centurion trusted so you could understand that grace reaches everyone. The tomb was sealed so the resurrection would be undeniable. And Jesus rose so you could rise with him. What will you do with that truth? How will you react to the proof? The same decision that faced those who observed these miracles firsthand now faces you. Will you observe or dismiss? Will you trust or rationalize away? Will you yield or remain quiet? This is beyond history. This is your welcome to experience the same resurrection strength that revived Jesus from death. It's your opportunity to move through the torn curtain into God's presence. It's your chance to discover hope beyond the burial site. If this message has awakened something in your heart, don't allow it to stay with you alone. Distribute it. Someone in your existence needs to hear that the blackness doesn't have the final word, that the tremor settles into stable foundation, that the curtain is torn and the path is open. Someone needs to understand that the burial site is vacant and hope is living. The 7 manifestations still indicate the same truth. Jesus is precisely who he claimed to be, and that transforms everything.